Moscow during the new economic policy era more than 100 years ago, a cool and rainy June of 1923, the capital is seething, boiling, and filled with public indignation. On the 6th, in the building of the Polytechnic Museum, it's so crowded you can't even drop an apple, as they say. The scandalous and long-awaited trial is about to begin. So many people gathered there that, according to the press of that time, from the judge's bench all you could see was a solid sea of heads. Moreover, posters for the upcoming event were put up all over Moscow. What interested the people of Moscow so much that the court session had to be moved to a large auditorium in the museum, which could hold up to 1,000 people? And that's not even counting those standing in the aisles and the huge crowd of onlookers outside. Today, we have a very large, serious, and in some ways, a fundamental piece for the channel, with sources taken from archives and libraries. In general, paper sources. I'll show them either in the video or in a separate post on the Streshnoti Telegram channel, depending on whether YouTube allows it or not. In any case, it's good work. I recommend watching and giving it a like or a dislike, and also subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. By the way, I rarely ask, but today's material is so good, though all channel content is decent, that I feel justified in asking. So, what was it that interested Muscovites a little over 100 years ago? The thing is, on that day, in a public open session, they were examining a sensational case about a terrible series of crimes, or rather, about a single crime that today we would call serial. 33 murders of peaceful townspeople were the work of a single man, an ordinary, unremarkable elderly fellow named Komarov, a cabman from Moscow's Horse Square. Back then, no one knew the word maniac, but there were no atrocities in the Moscow area more terrifying than those committed by this murderer. Today, we will talk about Vasily Komarov, the first maniac of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The revelation of the mystery of 33 victims in bags in Moscow, the murderer Komarov Petrov. This is what was written on numerous posters. For more than 2 years, the Shabolovsky beast, as Muscovites called Komarov, killed innocent men solely out of greed, taking lives methodically and calculatingly. Even the household business was put on stream, and everything in the house of this terrible man turned out to be specially adapted for his bloody trade, although he had another motive by which he justified prison and his monstrous crimes to himself. But more on that a little later. At Komarov's trial, correspondents from every single newspaper of the time were present, along with artists sketching the participants, criminologists, experts, psychologists, the leadership of the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department, and a thorough, comprehensive recording of the process was carried out for subsequent publication. Among the journalists, a young correspondent from the newspaper Gudok was sitting in the crowd. A couple of years ago, he had settled in Moscow as a doctor of medicine, having left his profession after the Civil War, having seen enough of all its horrors as a regimental doctor. Now he had taken up a literary path, in which he would later achieve worldwide fame. Few people do not know his name now, this young Mikhail Afanasievich Bulgakov, the future master. It is possible that it was partly thanks to his talent. The Komarov case caused such a public outcry that people talked, argued, and gossiped about it not only in Moscow, but throughout Russia and even abroad. Even the Berlin Weekly of Russian Immigration, Nakanune, published Bulgakov's article. What was Komarov accused of, and why was there a double surname on the posters? How did he end up like this? Did he act alone or with accomplices? I'll tell you all about this in today's video, in as much detail as possible, relying, as always, on documentary sources. Vasily Petrov, he changed his last name much later, was born in the Vitebsk province. Now, most of its former territory is part of Belarus, as well as the Smolensk and Pskov regions of Russia. Vasily grew up in a large family of a railway worker. One of 12 children, Terenti Petrov was an ordinary railway worker, not outstanding in any way, but he loved to drink. In fact, his whole family led a hard drinking life, like many rural residents of that time. Even the children met the same fate very early. Vasily, for example, started drinking hard liquor at the age of 10. As he himself said later, children imitated the bad habits of the older generation. Of course, in the Petrov family, everyone drank. The mother and father, the grandparents, and the older children. One of Vasily's brothers eventually ended up in penal servitude for taking a life while intoxicated. Perhaps it was childhood alcoholism that had a detrimental effect on the still developing psyche of the future murderer. By the age of 17, Vasily could not go a single day without drinking. Petrov was not taught to read or write. At the age of 12, he was sent to work, which was quite normal for the peasant environment at that time. Except for his early alcoholism, Vasily grew up as an ordinary child. But in that era, even the bad habits of rural children from working class and peasant families were almost the norm. In any case, no one held the parents accountable for this, and their children were not taken away to be placed in an orphanage. At that time, mostly homeless children ended up in orphanages, those who had run away from home on their own or were wandering around. Where will they end up after their parents die? Compared to them, Vasya Petrov grew up, albeit under poor supervision, but still under the care of relatives. Although in a family where everyone drank, fights and quarrels were commonplace, the children grew up on their own, like weeds. Natural selection had a rather positive effect on the health of the survivors, since child and especially infant mortality rates were quite high. Vasily was lucky in this regard. He was hardly ever sick. Nature, having taken the lives of many of his brothers and sisters, endowed this boy with remarkably strong health. A hard drinking lifestyle, of course, required money, and quite a lot of it. At first, the teenager somehow managed to get by, spending on alcohol the little he earned through honest work, sometimes as an errand boy, sometimes as a shepherd, sometimes as a laborer. At 16, Petrov got a job working for one of the local landowners, but the man turned out to be stingy. He paid almost nothing, so Vasily changed employers, but the new one didn't suit the young man either. He paid well, but made him work a lot. After that, Petrov went to work as a repairman with his father on the railroad. But as they say, appetite comes with eating. Vasily spent everything he earned on drinks and snacks and still didn't have enough money. And then the guy started stealing. Sometimes he would steal a chicken from the neighbors. Other times he would break into someone else's house and take valuable things. Komarov's constant drunkenness stopped for a while. Thanks to the military draft, Vasily was taken into the army at the age of 20, and from 1897 to 1901 he served 4 years of compulsory service in the Russian Imperial Army. Exactly how and where he served is not known for sure, but after returning home, nothing much changed in his life. For some time, Petrov went back to heavy drinking, and when he had nothing left to drink with, he started looking for any kind of work. In 1904, he suddenly went to work in the Far East, where Russia was at war with Japan at that time. There is no exact information about what exactly he was doing there. According to one version, he went as a volunteer. According to another, when hostilities began with the land of the rising sun, Vasily arrived at the front line to engage in various shady dealings. Most likely he was involved in a specific type of theft, almost carried out professionally. Valuables were stripped en masse from the dead. Crosses, icons, rings, and even gold, iron, or just healthy teeth were pried from their mouths. Everything was used. Everything could be sold. From these earnings, which were criminal in nature anyway, Vasily brought quite a lot of money back to his hometown and immediately got married at the age of 28, choosing a woman from his own village. The model of family relationships. Komarov brought the habits of his parents into his own young family. He and his wife, who turned out to be extremely jealous, often drank, argued, and fought. Nevertheless, their lives could not be called dull. The couple was constantly traveling back and forth across the vast Russian Empire in search of odd jobs, most likely once again with some criminal undertones, and alcohol kept them from getting bored. The newlyweds began to live large and denied themselves nothing. But at one point, the easy money ran out along with his wife, and after that, the final breakup began. They were constantly fighting now, because both Vasily and his wife liked to party and drink, and his wife demanded that he bring money home so she could feel comfortable. She clearly didn't like living in need. Under pressure from his wife, Petrov managed to get a job at one of the military warehouses. You'd think he could just live quietly and go to work, but no. Petrov quickly realized that honest work wouldn't be enough to provide the good life he and his wife had already gotten used to. Not wanting to work hard for his daily bread anymore, Petrov started stealing a little at his new job too, but it didn't bring the results he wanted. So Vasily thought hard about it once again, and then he went ahead and robbed the very warehouse where he worked, this time in a big way. He was arrested while trying to sell the stolen goods. The court handed down a surprisingly lenient sentence for those times, 1 year in prison, continued. While Vasily was serving his sentence, a tragedy struck the family. His wife died either from cholera or food poisoning. According to other versions, she either took her own life or simply left him and disappeared without a trace. This had a strong impact on Petrov. He started drinking even more and completely gave up working. After being released, Petrov decided to move somewhere far away to start his life over. He no longer had any family obligations, nothing tied him to any particular place, and he could go in any direction he wanted. He didn't want to go back home, so Petrov decided to move to Riga, a city one of his cellmates had told him many good things about. In the city by the North Sea, Vasily married a Polish widow named Sofia, who had 2 young children from her first marriage, and for a while he almost settled down. However, he never managed to overcome his alcoholism and often beat his new wife and her children. His second wife was easygoing and didn't drink. And Vasily, who was used to a different kind of family relationship, often missed the emotional ups and downs and the intensity of passion. That's why he would just whip his wife and her children with reins, so to speak, as a preventive measure. But apparently Sofia was fine with everything, or at least let's not engage in victim blaming. Maybe she wasn't fine with it, but at least her husband fed her and gave her and her children a roof over their heads. Apparently this woman, who was raising 2 children on her own, had a difficult life situation. Since she agreed to become the wife of a chronic alcoholic, after all, her newlywed husband never showed her much love. He himself spoke contemptuously about this marriage to the widowed Polka, saying, "Let this Roman Catholic trash eat beside me," because Sofia belonged to a different Christian denomination. The head of the family often reproached her over food and kept her in fear, speaking about his new family with a sneer. There was no real malice, but sometimes I slapped her and I beat the children, for their own good, so they would learn. Later, the familiar order of the Russian Empire was disrupted by World War I in 1915. The peaceful life of the people of Riga was completely disrupted by the approach of the Kaiser's troops. Like many others, Petrov left the Baltics during the troubled times, fearing the invasion of the enemy army. This time he chose the calm and still prosperous Volga region to live in, but once again miscalculated. Soon, a revolution broke out in the country. However, the idea of taking everything away and dividing it up, in other words, simply looting the estates and city houses of the former masters of life, really appealed to Vasily. And of course, he wasn't the only one. Looting flourished like never before. Petrov settled into the new state order better than anyone else. A prison sentence greatly contributed to his image as an oppressed proletarian. Komarov successfully presented himself as an innocent victim of the Tsarist regime, and no one wanted to delve into the details of his biography during those turbulent times. Vasily himself soon learned the basics of literacy and began actively fighting against counter-revolution. In 1917 he volunteered for the Red Army, where he managed to rise to the rank of platoon commander by his early 40s. During his service, Petrov took great pleasure in participating in punitive expeditions, and for some time even led a firing squad that carried out swift executions of white guards. He openly enjoyed it. He destroyed alien class elements with great enthusiasm. It was in the Red Army that Petrov developed a perverse attitude toward taking lives as an educational method of class struggle. He even began to derive pleasure from executing deserters and enemies of the revolution. Later, during interrogations, Vasily Vlechuna would recall his first execution of a deserter by the spark that lit up in Petrov's eyes. The detectives realized that this was the very turning point after which Vasily stopped being normal. 2 years later, during one of the battles, Petrov was captured by the White Guards. It is known that he was captured by soldiers from Denikin's army, and for some time was even considered dead. But just a year later, he somehow found himself free, and no longer under the close watch of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. What happened to Petrov while he was in captivity? There is no exact information about this. According to one version, he somehow managed to escape on his own. According to another, the Whites recruited him and turned him into their secret agent. But there is no evidence to support this, not even indirect evidence. He was likely held captive to avoid trial by the Military Revolutionary Tribunal. For his feats performed under the red flag, Commander Pyotr called himself by another name and became Private Vasily Ivanovich Komarov. He had no documents on him, and he had prudently torn off all his military insignia, so his new name was recorded from his own words. Such things happened during the revolution. The newspapers of the 1920s all wrote in unison that the future murderer got rid of his real last names and patronymic to cover up the traces of his dark deeds. During the years of the Civil War, at the end of 1920, when the armed confrontation between the Reds and the Whites came to an end, Vasily, already under a new name, settled in Moscow and moved into house number 26 on Shabolovka Street. Interestingly, in the capital of the young Soviet state, Petrov Komarov immediately bought himself a house, not rented, but specifically bought it. After some time, his family moved here as well. The question of how the former prisoner came into possession of such a substantial sum of money remains unanswered to this day. It was this very circumstance that actually gave rise to rumors about him being recruited by the White Guards. But all of that would come later, a few years down the line, when the bad reputation of this man would sweep through Moscow like a wave. But for now, he needed something to live on. Sometimes his pockets were empty, sometimes they were full. That's how the gloomy cabman himself described his financial situation when he was questioned in court about his sources of income. Komarov always had a strong aversion to work, but there was no other way. He was out of money again, and he was forced to go around looking for a new source of income. In the capital, even one ravaged by war and revolution, life had never been cheap. Finally, he got a job as a cabman at the Central Committee for Population Evacuation. But Vasily didn't last long there. He stole the goods and belongings he was transporting too often, and told his superiors that he'd been robbed on the way, then sold the stolen items himself at the market. The negligent cabman was kicked out in disgrace. It's amazing he wasn't brought before a tribunal. There are a lot of blank spots in this man's biography, and too often he managed to get away with things unscathed. After leaving his job, Komarov decided to become a private cab driver. At that time, people in his profession were called vankas. It was a common term, similar to how taxi drivers are now called drivers. The entire territory of Moscow was divided among competing companies that transported paying customers. At that time, trams and cars had not yet pushed horses off the streets of Moscow. Vasily settled at the Horse Square, which today is the site of the Morozovskaya Hospital. Only Konoy Lane, the very one that was mentioned in the famous Komarovsky case, reminds us of the old place names. Komarov began taking the lives of peaceful citizens in 1921, when the new economic policy was announced and private businesses were allowed again. Despite the economic relaxations, Komarov still decided that there was an easier way to make money. Vasily thought like this: if people want to buy a horse, it means they have money, and that money can simply be taken from them along with their lives. However, the first time it happened, it wasn't planned but almost spontaneously. The first taking of a life in this series was committed by Petrov Komarov on March 13, 1921. At least, that's the date he himself mentioned during the interrogations. After that, the bloody trade was placed on a terrifying conveyor belt. Vasily Komarov committed all his crimes according to the same established scenario. He would come to the horse market, watch for a long time, and look for a lone buyer, mostly visiting peasants so that no one would look for them right away, and offer to sell them a horse, showing his goods, the very same horse he used for cab driving. They would agree on a price, which Komarov always said to be very favorable for the buyer. It's quite likely that this gave the impression that the horse was stolen, so they tried to make the deal quietly. The seller would invite the buyer to his home to finalize all the details and celebrate the purchase. Everyone, without exception, agreed to hand over the money in plain sight. It was unwise to do so for a stolen horse. If, during the conversation, one of the passengers of the bloody cabman mentioned that they were planning to buy a horse, Komarov would tell them that he could sell his own. He would name an obviously low price, explaining that he urgently needed the money. He would take the delighted buyer to his place, where he would get acquainted with the wealthy client who wanted to buy his goods up close. And then he would get them drunk on vodka until they lost consciousness and beat them to death, just like they slaughter dumb cattle in villages and slaughterhouses, with precise and powerful blows of a heavy hammer to the head. Sometimes, for extra security, Petrov would also strangle his victims, take all their money and valuables, and then pack the bodies in a sack and hide them carefully. He approached the killing with professional skill and soon learned how to split human skulls with a single blow. Yes, so that none of the neighbors heard the victims' dying screams. Before that, Vasily would send his wife and children away under a plausible pretext and securely lock all the doors in the house. He disposed of the bodies without haste and very efficiently, so that it would be convenient to stuff the corpses into sacks. Komarov would first drain all their blood. For this gruesome procedure, he even acquired special mats, coarse fabric folded in several layers, and separate galvanized tubs. Later, rumors would spread around Moscow that he used the blood of his victims as well as their flesh. Komarov fed his pigs with it, and if only he had bought more pigs, he later smirked. When he was asked this question during the trial, the capital didn't get alarmed right away. At first, everything was quiet and smooth, and it seemed like no one was even looking for the poor peasants who were innocently deprived of life by Komarovsky. Most likely, it was exactly this that encouraged the monster to increase the pace of his terrible craft. But then one body was discovered, and after that another. And then, as the young Bulgakov wrote in his essay, cheap grey sacks giving off a foul, nauseating smell began to appear more and more often in Zamoskvorechi. Of course, there were curious daredevils, and the foul-smelling finds were opened, revealing terrible discoveries. People reacted differently. Some felt sick at what they saw, some wrinkled their noses in disgust, and some began to pray fervently. After all, inside the bags were corpses tied in a special way, their bodies rotting and decomposing. The case immediately caused a great public outcry. Later, when Dushegub was already caught, people said that Komarov made a fortune from taking lives, but in reality his loot was nothing impressive. Shabalovsky Dushegub even became a character in urban folklore. Many famous writers wrote about him, not only Mikhail Bulgakov but also Ilya Ilf, Yevgeny Petrov, Yuri Olesha and others. From the memoirs of journalist Mikhail Bulgakov, who worked at the time, that's how they kill livestock, without regret, but also without any hatred. He made a profit, but not a fantastically large one. The buyer had roughly the price of a horse in his pocket. He didn't have any riches hidden in pillowcases, but he drank and ate with that money, supported his family, and basically ran a slaughterhouse at his place. The future author of great works, while working as a journalist, honestly admitted, "I have no desire to write a crime feuilleton, I assure the reader. But there's no way to do anything else, because today the desire to understand this Komarov just won't leave my mind all day." That's how the newspaper article Komarov's Case appeared, dedicated to the story of a man who, for 2 years during the new economic policy era, kept all of Moscow in fear. In 1921, the Strangler committed at least 17 murders, and in the following 2 years, about 12 more, although he later confessed to 33 murders. The bodies of the murdered men were found in the Moscow River, under bridges, in thickets of reeds, in ruined houses, and shallowly buried in the ground. According to Komarov himself, the whole execution procedure took no more than half an hour. After taking a life, he would say his signature phrase, "Razik vas," and even by his own admission, he would pray for the souls of those he had killed. And Komarov committed his first crime in this series almost spontaneously. His victim was a fairly young peasant who, like all the other unfortunate souls who later shared his terrible fate, had come to Moscow for a horse. At the horse square, he approached Vasily Ivanovich Komarov himself. It happened on a snowy February day. Komarov was, as usual, a bit tipsy and quickly struck up a conversation with the young man who had approached him. The young man started asking where he could buy a horse at a reasonable price. Vasily, according to him, really was planning to sell his horse at that time and buy another one, a livelier one. The peasant gave a deliberately low price, following the era's custom to allow proper bargaining. But, to his surprise, the seller agreed to it too quickly, after which he invited the buyer to come to his house so they could properly celebrate the deal. To his misfortune, the peasant agreed. Over a glass of vodka, he told the friendly Muscovite, "I'll resell the horse in a remote village. For such an animal they'll give me bushels of grain. I'll make the trade, then sell it in the capital for a profit." And that's when Komarov felt a terrible rage. Perhaps before this he had only planned to rob the buyer, or at most give him a good beating, since he was physically strong. But now, sitting in front of him, smiling and boasting about his business plan, was this man, a real speculator, and Komarov hated speculators with a passion. He certainly had his own personal reasons for that, but even if he was caught, he was in no hurry to talk about them. The only thing anyone managed to find out was that, in Komarov's opinion, it was greed and speculation that caused all the misfortunes of the Russian people and his own personal tragedy. In particular, there were theories that his first wife ran away with some speculator, and he was never able to forget it. Still, at Komarov's house the men enjoyed a good drink. They had to celebrate their successful deal. According to Vasily Ivanovich's own recollections, he didn't intend to take the peasant's life at that time. It was the excessive frankness of the buyer he didn't like that pushed him to sin. It was from this heart-to-heart conversation that he learned his guest was just an ordinary reseller. If before this Vasily himself still didn't really know what he wanted, now he made a final decision. There's no need to feel sorry for someone who plans to profit at the expense of others. Someone else's business acumen frankly infuriated Vasily, but it didn't throw him off balance. He got up from the table and left the room. Under some plausible pretext, he went into the storeroom and after searching for a while, took a rusty hammer that had been lying around unused. With it, he struck the now dazed guest on the head with terrible force, splitting his skull apart. The blood that gushed out splattered everything around, the floor, the table, the benches, and even the criminal's own clothes, but not a single muscle twitched. There was no sign of remorse or fear on his face, only an uncontrollable euphoria from realizing his power over human life. Dark human blood flooded the entire room, and Komarov spent quite a bit of time cleaning up, which made him very displeased. He never allowed such mistakes with human blood again. He took this unfortunate mishap into account, and next time he acted more cautiously, before smashing in the head of his next victim. The owner of the home-based life-taking factory would place a bucket or a basin underneath. That very first victim, the trusting peasant middleman, beaten to death with a rusty hammer. Komarov carried him out of the house under the cover of darkness and buried him in a neighboring abandoned lot, overgrown with bushes and weeds. There were plenty of such abandoned houses in devastated Moscow at that time. Money for the dead. The criminal, of course, took everything down to the last penny and didn't even hesitate to take the iron teeth, pulling them out of the dead man's mouth with pliers. As it turned out during the investigation in general, Vasily found it quite easy to take a life for the first time. Later, though, he said that he hesitated before his first kill. He made the decision after a few shots of vodka, but he didn't regret what he had done at all, since it brought him good money. He also sold all the belongings of the murdered man at the local market and used the money to buy a large bottle of moonshine. After drinking away all the profit, Komarov went back to his dark business in his new hunting grounds at the horse market of Moscow. He committed his second murder quickly. After all, the money ran out soon, and then things just kept going from there. In 1921 alone, Komarov took the lives of about 20 people. All of them, like the first victim, were middlemen from villages, hoping to make a little money by reselling goods. Vasily Ivanovich found almost all of his clients most often at the horse market, then lured them to his house and took their lives. A blow to the crown of the head with a hammer. There was always a ceremony of washing before the sale and purchase. Beforehand, Komarov would often strangle his guests, especially if the visitor was strong and well built, just in case, as a precaution, so that he wouldn't. Then he would undress them. He would drain their blood, tie them up tightly, first putting the corpse in a characteristic fetal position, and carefully pack it into a bag, and at night he would get rid of his dead cargo. Despite being generally described as a simple-minded person, Komarov approached the task of packing the body quite thoughtfully, first putting the still warm, pliable corpse into the position of a child in the womb, especially carefully tying the head to the legs with a strong rope, so that, just by looking at the bag, it would be impossible to tell what was inside. Komarov quickly got a taste for it. The feeling of permissiveness, impunity, and easy money went to his head. Vasily Ivanovich was not afraid of anything. According to the criminal case materials, Komarov hid 15 bodies in a half-ruined building on Konoy Lane and in a neighboring abandoned house on Shabolovka. He buried 6 more bodies on the grounds of the former estate of Count Alexei Orlov, not far from the Donskoy monastery. In addition, Komarov dumped bodies, attaching bags weighted with stones into various bodies of water, including the Moskva River, the Yauza River, and some ponds. Back in 1923, which is now very distant from us, during the early days of the Soviet police, rookie detectives had to face a truly difficult task. When reports about missing men started coming in, no one really paid much attention to them. As a rule, these were Muscovites involved in horse trading, or more often, peasants who came to the capital to buy a draft animal essential for their farms. The story was always the same. He went to the horse market at Serpukovka and never came back. Well, At that time, no one was talking about people being killed. Various other versions were considered, from forming a gang of horse thieves. Horses often disappeared in the capital as well, but the Shabalovsky murderer had nothing to do with their disappearance. However, soon after, terrifying foul-smelling bags containing human corpses began to be pulled out of Moscow's bodies of water. After about 17 killings, Vasily realized that there was nowhere left nearby to hide the bodies. The abandoned lot had turned into a mass grave, and he didn't dare look for a burial site in more remote places. So he just started dumping them into the Moskva River and the Yauza, still in the same bags. The deadly conveyor worked like clockwork. Even though the serial killer wasn't particularly smart and didn't even try to cover his tracks, when more than a dozen bodies were found, Muscovites started to panic, but the suspicion of a serial killer didn't arise immediately. Although the same pattern was visible, all the victims were men, all were undressed, all tied up in the same way, or rather, their legs were tied to their chest, their head between their knees, their arms fastened behind their back, and their hands taped to their torso. All of them were killed by a powerful blow with something heavy to the crown or the temple. Their faces were disfigured, which made it extremely difficult to identify them. Moreover, as it turned out later, most of the victims were visitors, and they had no friends or acquaintances in Moscow. The fact that the news about the loss of life was delayed for almost a year was not surprising, since most of the victims were visitors from various villages, often not even nearby ones. Their relatives could not know exactly where they disappeared, in Moscow or on the way to the capital. But when bags with decomposed bodies started being pulled out of the rivers from time to time, law enforcement officers began to bustle about, but the investigation remained slow at first, created by Dimitrorzok. In 1922, Komarov had a son of his own. In the winter of that same year, Komarov's wife accidentally found out both about the taking of lives and about her husband's real source of income, but she reacted to this surprisingly calmly. One day, Sofia came home at an unusual time and caught her husband dismembering a corpse. Komarov didn't bother with long explanations. Why would a foolish woman need them? And just said simply, "Get used to it, that's all." This way of making money didn't bother the woman in the slightest. Sofia didn't scream in horror or rush to turn her husband into the police. Instead, she became his accomplice. She silently took a rag and started wiping the blood splatters off the floor. Thus, the serial killer gained a reliable accomplice. When his wife saw that her husband was coming home with an unfamiliar man, she would simply leave, take the children with her, and then come back later, at first alone. Leaving her circle of acquaintances, Sofia became her husband's loyal assistant and carefully cleaned the room of blood after another crime. It should be said that the woman handled the destruction of evidence perfectly. Later, investigators tried to find at least some traces of blood in the room where 30 people were killed, but they couldn't. At first, the wife only helped her husband get rid of evidence and dead clients, but later she joined him completely, sometimes helping to hold the victim or tie up the bodies more securely. The Komarovs continued down this bloody path together. At that time, the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department was less than 5 years old. At that time, the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department was led by Ivan Nikolaev, a Civil War artilleryman, non-partisan, and otherwise unremarkable. The newly established Moscow police only began an official investigation after the body of yet another victim was discovered in May 1922. Komarov, who had lain in some hole for a particularly long time and looked terrible because of it. After searching Moscow's slums and wastelands, investigators found more bags containing naked male bodies. It seemed like this would never end. The people of Moscow were gripped by terror. In almost every case, the cause of death was a terrible blow to the head with a blunt object. In addition, Cyrenik was extremely skilled at packing the bodies of the victims into identical bags. Everything indicated that the killings were the work of a single gang or even a single person. Here is an excerpt from Bulgakov's story, The Komarov Case, which he would write later, based on investigation materials and his own newspaper article. At night, strange and unpleasant discoveries were found in the wastelands beyond Moskvorechi, in ruined houses, in abandoned, unfinished bathhouses. On Shabolovka, foul-smelling grey bags would turn up, and inside them were the naked bodies of men. After several such discoveries, according to the writer, a sharp sense of alarm began in the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department. All the bags with bodies bore the marks of the same hands, the same workmanship. Besides the fact that the heads were smashed most likely with the same blunt object, the way the bodies were tied was identical, always skillful and neat, with the arms and legs pulled to the stomach and, as Bulgakov emphasized, tied securely and conscientiously. Soon the detectives noticed that the bags were being tied. It was typical of how people used to harnessing horses do it. This led them to the theory that the likely perpetrator was a cabman. The discovery of grains of oats, the main food for horses, in one of the bags with the body served as confirmation of this hypothesis. Another clue was the location of the gruesome discoveries. Most of them were in Zamoskvorechi. This led to the thought that the terrifying criminal himself lived somewhere nearby. Meanwhile, rumors about the terrible murders were spreading not only in Moscow, and human imagination gave rise to the most incredible assumptions. Some spoke of a mysterious shapeshifter who tormented his victims on deserted wastelands during moonlit nights, while others talked about vampires who sucked all the blood from people. One thing was clear: it was impossible to escape from this creature, whoever or whatever it was. But the press just fueled the fire. Just like today, the press aimed for loud, shocking headlines and clickbait. So in articles about the horrific discoveries, catchy nicknames for the unknown villain appeared: the Packer, the Beast Man, the Shabolovsky Strangler. But Mikhail Bulgakov believed that the criminal did not deserve such epithets, because what was shocking was not his beastly appearance, but his dullness and ordinariness. He wrote that Komarov did not stand out in any special way from his environment. Outside of this, he was just an ordinary bad person, like millions of others. He beat both his wife and children, and he drank. But on holidays he would invite priests to his home. That is, they would hold services at his place, and he would treat them to wine. In general, he was religious and a man of difficult character. The Murov detectives worked themselves to exhaustion, all trying to find the trail, the murderer. The order for his prompt capture came from the very top. The Bolsheviks didn't like the spreading rumors at all about bloody retribution for their crimes against the royal family. Popular rumor attributed the terrible discoveries in the bags almost to the Antichrist himself, and malicious tongues kept saying that this was only the beginning. But then, at the bottom of a few more bags, traces of oats were found. There was a strong likelihood that the culprit was the cabman himself. 22 bodies have been found, but only 7 identified. It was determined that all of them were heading to Moscow. Regarding the horse issue, it was undoubtedly a cabman or someone closely connected to horse affairs who was involved here. Later, the police established that all the identified deceased had visited the horse market before their deaths. By finding more remains through traces of oats in the bags and some other evidence, they were finally able to confirm that the criminal was most likely a cabman. But the problem was that at that time, it was a very common profession in Moscow, and it turned out to be very difficult to identify the wanted criminal among so many people. At that time, there were more than 5,000 cab drivers working in the capital, and besides that, anyone who simply had a horse, a carriage, or even a cart often worked as a cab driver as well. An accident caused by Komarov's own mistake helped the investigation. In late spring of 1922, police officers pulled a heavy sack stuck near the shore out of the Moscow River Canal. It was a simple canvas sack, the kind usually used to store various kinds of food. The police officers didn't even need to look inside to be sure of what they would find. The crowd of onlookers that had gathered around accompanied the retrieval of the sack with angry and anxious comments, all about the same Antichrist. Someone felt sick, the village fool started screaming, the women gasped and crossed themselves, people were on edge. 2 hours later, the report on the work done was on the desk of Comrade Kornev, who was then head of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. This was already the 6th dead body, clearly not killed by bandit raiders. In a bloody showdown over the past couple of months, a shattered skull, drained blood, the peculiar way the bodies were arranged, all of this clearly indicated that a beast in human form had appeared in the city. Public unrest and complaints about the inaction of the new authorities only added fuel to the fire, and now Kornev himself had to rack his brain over the fate handed to him, a difficult task. Unfortunately, this time, just like all the previous times, the criminal left no significant clues that could expose him. And since at that time there were neither prominent psychologists nor brilliant forensic experts in the new police force, the police officers acted the old-fashioned way. They questioned horse dealers and fodder merchants and searched horse markets and parking areas. The task turned out to be overwhelming. In addition to regular cab drivers, both legal and freelance, there were also heavy haulers transporting goods. It was simply impossible to check such a large number of people quickly, and the investigation reached a dead end. Unexpectedly, Dushagub himself helped the investigators. The smashed head of the next victim, the one who was pulled out of the Moscow River Canal, was wrapped in a fresh, carelessly washed baby diaper. This made it possible to assume that they should look among families where a child was recently born. There were far fewer such families in Moscow, and the circle of suspects immediately narrowed. So far the police officers knew little about Dushagub. The most obvious trait was his cruelty and enormous physical strength. He struck all his victims from behind on the head with a heavy blunt object, splitting strong skull bones with a single blow like a large nut. It was quite likely that the weapon used in the crime could have been a large hammer. At the same time, Dushagub would wait until all the blood had drained from the body, and only after that would he begin tying it up and packing it into a bag. Apparently, Vasily Ivanovich became so carried away with taking lives that he lost his vigilance. He was sure that he couldn't be tracked down, or maybe he simply didn't care due to his lack of intelligence. So one day he used the first rag he could find, which happened to be a child's diaper. Most likely Komarov was too lazy to look for something more suitable, so he decided not to bother with trivialities and thought this would do just fine. Meanwhile, the fact that there was a small, recently born child really helped the detectives in their search among the cab drivers in Zamoskvorechi. Among others, Vasily Ivanovich Komarov, 55 years old, who lived at 26 Shabolovka and worked as a cab driver at Horse Square, was also among the suspects. The interviewed merchants told the detectives about Komarov's strange behavior. Instead of competing for customers like everyone else, on the contrary, he never haggled, but would stand around for a long time, even though he regularly attended the horse market, had money, and often partied in the nearby taverns. Questioning other cab drivers confirmed the police officer's version. Everyone unanimously claimed that Vasily Ivanovich was a strange man. He never bargained and always went somewhere with a potential horse buyer. Did he really have an entire horse farm on Shabolovka? At the same time, Komarov always had money on him, even though he often left large sums in taverns. Amounts so huge most people couldn't imagine them, yet this cabman would spend it all in one night. Here's a documentary excerpt on capital prices at that time to help you understand. The latest market prices were as follows: butter 36 million, smoked sausage 48,100,000, medium quality cigarettes 30 to 40 million, a single box of matches 1 million, and drinking establishments. For those who have billions for pocket expenses, spirits 250 million per bottle, beer 30 million per bottle. So pay attention. Right now the prices are still quite reasonable compared to what they were in the early 1920s. But of course, before all the know-it-all commentators rush in, it should be noted that from November 1917 until the end of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks encouraged hyperinflation, and at the same time several different types of currency were in circulation: Tsarist, Duma, and Kerensky notes. And that's not all. Since 1918, many regions began printing their own money, and at the beginning of 1919, so-called sovznaks also appeared and circulated, until the 1924 reform. With the introduction of the new economic policy, inflation became rampant. One Soviet banknote of 100,000 rubles became equal to a pre-war kopeck. Groceries were sold for millions and billions at the same time. At the end of 1922, there was an attempt to introduce new Soviet chevronnets backed by gold reserves, but the circulation of the new currency compared to the old money was very small. This led to confusion. Mostly, the same millions were still in circulation, and only occasionally were goods sold for kopecks in the new banknotes, while gold chevronnets began to be minted. And only at the beginning of 1924, silver and copper coins were issued in Moscow dated 1923 for the domestic market, while for foreign trade. During the lifetime of the Shabolovsky murderer, the vast majority of transactions among ordinary people were carried out with old banknotes, and Komarov undoubtedly lived it up, throwing around easy, deadly money left and right. That's exactly how he would later talk about them. And it also turns out that Komarov was a billionaire. The police officers did truly colossal work and, through their combined efforts, eventually tracked down Komarov. The agents' wide net covered the horse squares, tea stands, taverns. They followed the trail of the Zamoskvorechi cabman, and at that time another body was found with a fresh cloth wrapped around the smashed head, and the net immediately tightened. They were looking for a family man, one who had recently had a child, and among 1,000 cabmen they found him. Vasily Ivanovich Komarov lived on Shabolovka. In house number 26, always had money, drank a lot. That's how Bulgakov described the investigation. And also, from a Moscow newspaper, another correspondent paid attention to Vasily Komarov, a horse-drawn cabman, because of his very strange behavior. He would arrive at the spot and stand there for a long time, as if looking out for someone, and he didn't compete for passengers like the others, which was unusual for a Moscow cabman. In addition, as the neighbors testified, his wife had indeed recently given birth. On the evening of May 17, 1923, the police burst into Komarov's apartment with a search warrant. According to the official version, they were not looking for a serial killer who had murdered 30 people, but merely for moonshiners. And since Vasily was practically always drunk, it was no surprise that they paid him a visit too. The cabmen greeted the lawmen good-naturedly, smiling at them in a friendly way. Komarov was completely calm, but when the thorough search began, he suddenly became nervous. The experts tried to find traces of blood on the floor, but in vain. His wife Sofia did her job excellently, and at that time there were no other methods except for visual inspection. When the detectives reached the storeroom, the owner of the house suddenly screamed as if stung and jumped out the second-floor window. Obviously his nerves gave out. Down below, in an ambush, a second police squad was waiting, trying to detain the suspect. But Komarov, showing remarkable strength, broke free and disappeared in an unknown direction. Lost among the many houses in the slums, his wife Sofia sank to the floor and burst into bitter tears. Soon, the reason for such a sudden escape became clear. In the storage room, the police officers found Komarov's latest victim with a smashed head. The body hadn't even cooled yet, and nearby was a basin filled with drained blood. As it was later discovered, this was Ivan Lapin, a peasant from the Moscow region and father of 4 children. Komarov didn't stay on the run for long. That same night he was arrested in the village of Nikolskoye near Moscow, at an acquaintance's, a milkmaid. Apparently, this woman was the murderer's lover, and he was staying at her house. The suspect, as Mikhail Bulgakov noted, wrote statements about the lives he had taken on the back of his identification card, and in these statements, for some reason, he confused and falsely accused his neighbors, but the capture of Komarov did not. The townspeople were so frightened that they didn't believe in the success of the investigation. They whispered that they had caught the wrong person, that this old drunkard didn't seem like a monster. Yes, they only started looking for the real villain thanks to the highest order from Lenin. They just wanted to close the case quickly. Moscow buzzed and groaned about the Shabolovsky murderer, even scaring children. During interrogations, the serial killer, already resigned to being caught, behaved freely and cynically. He spoke openly about taking lives, clearly savoring the details. Only after Komarov was detained and the first interrogations took place did the true scale of his crimes become clear, many of which the police had no idea about. The cabman confessed to 33 murders. Based on his testimony, they managed to find the bodies of only 29 victims, so he was tried only for those whose bodies could be found. However, considering the fact that lately Komarov, tired of carefully hiding the bodies of his victims, simply dumped them into the Moskva River and before that buried them wherever he could, it's quite likely that the other 4 bodies just couldn't be found. After all, hungry stray dogs were also not averse to feeding on human flesh, often destroying all the evidence by literally eating it. Once, when Komarov was taken out for investigative actions in the city, where he was supposed to point out more burial sites, the police literally had to save his life. Moscow residents were prepared to take swift vigilante action against him. Times change, but people don't. With great difficulty, they managed to rescue the criminal, and every time Komarov was showing the burial sites, angry crowds of screaming, frenzied people had to be pushed back with effort. It was not easy to conduct such investigative activities with a serial killer. They had to move around Moscow, but everywhere Komarov went, he was awaited by crazed citizens, people thirsting for his blood. People demanded that the monster be handed over to them so they could beat him, and they came up with various punishments for him that they thought were appropriate. For example, to boil him alive in the square, burn him at the stake, or quarter him, like in the old, I won't say good times. Most of the remains of Vasily Komarov's victims were discovered only after he was caught. Komarov, like a true maniac, spoke about these killings with particular cynicism and pleasure. He insisted that his motive was not even greed, but a kind of perverted sense of social justice, since according to him, he only killed speculators, whom he contemptuously called Komuts. According to Vasily, this was a kind of service to society, since speculators cause a lot of harm and no good. The murderer assured everyone that he was fighting against criminal speculation and human greed. A real hero, in a word, a well-known poet and publicist of those times. Demyan Bedny saw even a political conspiracy in Komarov's actions, wondering how a simple cabman like Komarov could afford a horse and an apartment. It's no coincidence that he spent a year with Denikin. He must have been recruited by enemy counterintelligence and sent to the capital as an agent. With such accusatory articles, Bedny spoke in the press and in public squares, gathering crowds of sympathizers around him. But he clearly isn't smart enough to be a spy. Komarov didn't try to explain the villainy of the Shabolovsky beast by claiming he belonged to the White Guards. The police and the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs weren't in a hurry either, considering that during the Civil War he fought on the side of the Red Army. The motives of maniacs don't follow ordinary human logic. Komarov didn't feel any remorse, and he accompanied the description of each murder with his own cynical phrase. He kept squinting in a simple-minded way and spiced up his already meager speech with various silly jokes. When asked by journalists, "Aren't you afraid of death itself?" "I'm not afraid of Mother Death or the Bald Devil," answered Koshmarov, the nightmare cabman. Perhaps Komarov really wasn't afraid of death, but more likely not because of excessive courage, but due to a terrifying emptiness inside. Even during the preliminary investigation, psychiatrists were involved in the case, in particular Yevgeny Krasnushkin, one of the founders of Soviet forensic psychiatry and the Serbsky Institute. They especially noted the dullness of social feelings in both spouses, since Sumkin's accomplice was his own, quite young wife. Medical season. Tags G-cards, Tarnitsin often. Komarov spoke about everything with a contemptuous, mocking grin, including the hardships of life. He called people oddballs and referred to his victims as yokes. How he killed, nobody knows, and at the same time he gives a nasty giggle. Do you have any last wishes? Well, I always dreamed of killing a gypsy woman or a priest, but why? Just jokes out of place, all mocking grimaces, everything in life, this cocky, vile jerk, always accompanied by giggling, marveled the future author of Master and Margarita. What shocked the public most was the sheer dull indifference. What kind of savagery is this? If a beast hated and killed with rage, it wouldn't offend everyone around as much as this astonishing contempt did. No Dostoevsky-like torment was present here. On the defendant's bench sat only the shell of a man, like the casing of a watch with its mechanism removed. At the same time, Komarov's answers were extremely inconsistent. First, he said God would forgive everything, and then, when the prosecutor asked if the defendants believed in God, he answered with an unchanging smirk, "The revolution proved it's a lie. I only believe in a hedgehog because he's tough." At the same time, he kept icons in the house and invited a priest on holidays. You faithfully read the gospel, pray well, and it doesn't matter that you killed, but don't you feel sorry for those lost? Journalists asked Komarov that during the trial. You can feel sorry before taking a life, but what's the point after? He shrugged and replied, subtitles, "Are you scared of the execution?" The murderer shook his head thoughtfully. We all shuddered. His jokes were completely out of place. Sparse and absurd thoughts, shining with human foolishness, a magnificent amalgam of that specific foul rudeness that so many petty bourgeois from Zamoskvoreshye are steeped in, wrote Komarova. Bulgakov. Shabulovsky the fiend did not repent at all. Moreover, he said he was ready to commit another 60 if needed. My wife loves sweets, and I prefer bitter drinks. I've become a hero in Moscow now, he proudly admitted after his arrest. Indeed, this serial killer became incredibly famous, and even as a literary character, he appeared on the pages of many books of that era. In the novel One Story America, Ilfin Petrov even compared the first Soviet maniac to the famous Chicago gangster. Famous bandit killers like the cabman Komarov, only much more dangerous. Here's a quote from their book. After the high-profile trial, legends about Komarov's violence began to circulate all over Moscow. While the investigation was ongoing, Moscow was buzzing. In short, when people said Komarov the cabman, women talked about pillowcases full of money, about how Komarov fed human entrails to pigs and things like that. That was the plain truth that came out during the investigation. The kind of truth that made you wish there really were pillowcases full of money, or even disgusting pig feedings, or some kind of monstrous perversions. It might have been easier if it had been more complicated and terrifying, because then the most frightening thing about the whole case would have become clear. This person, Komarov himself, wrote Mikhail Bulgakov. Vasily Terentievich Petrov's real name was revealed only during the investigation. These are excerpts from Komarov's case files. He was born either in 1877 or 1878 in the Vitebsk province. His father was an alcoholic, and when he got drunk, he beat his mother. His large family was in such need that Vasily was sent to work for the local landowner when he was only 12 years old. At 15, he had his first sexual intercourse with a female worker, and by that time, he could already be considered a complete alcoholic. He drank indiscriminately, not shying away from anything, including bookbinding glue or denatured alcohol. And since his youth, Komarov was known for his desire to change places, which could be considered a tendency toward vagrancy. He had a bad relationship with his first wife. She turned out to be quarrelsome and was constantly jealous of her husband, although he himself admitted that he was completely indifferent to such matters. Right after the revolution, he joined the Red Guard, but only during the trial for multiple deprivations of life. These merits before the new government did not help Petrov Komarov in any way. He could no longer boast about his proletarian background, claiming to be humiliated and insulted, a victim of the Tsarist regime. He quickly made his way into the national ranks, became a platoon commander under Starkov's revolutionary hierarchy, our non-commissioned officer. At the trial, Komarov recalled with pleasure how he once commanded a firing squad during an execution. He supposedly enjoyed it, or so the journalists wrote about the biography of the Shabalovsky beast. A forensic psychiatric examination was also appointed for the high-profile case, and they searched for a long time for more or less well-known doctors in the field of psychiatry. They needed 3 for the medical verdict, but there were very few left, and one was even invited from St. Petersburg. And so this panel of psychiatric professors examined the accused for a long time, questioned him, conducted various experiments on him, and finally found Komarov fully guilty. The psychiatrist's verdict stated, despite his alcoholism, Komarov is sane and can be held responsible for his actions. However, the examination separately noted that the accused is an alcoholic degenerate and a psychopath, which, however, does not deprive him of the ability to understand his actions and control them. Along with her husband, the wife and accomplice also ended up on the defendant's bench. After reviewing the case materials, the investigation also charged her, and the court upheld the charges. The wife, who was used to domestic violence, became a perfect match for her alcoholic husband, who had developed sadistic tendencies. In a drunken frenzy, he repeatedly beat her and the children mercilessly with reins, but she patiently, even with clear signs of masochism, endured these beatings. During the investigation, it was revealed that Sofia Komarova was also involved in some of the murders, helping to restrain the victims, transport the bodies, and cover up the traces of the crime. The serial killer himself insisted that neither his wife nor his children were present during the murders in the house. Komarov claimed that whenever a buyer appeared, he would always send them out of the house. And Sofia would always lock the door from the outside to make sure the victim had no chance to escape. But the investigation was able to prove that the wife actively helped her husband get rid of the evidence and the bodies after she found out about the murders. And at night she would fervently pray for the souls of the newly departed servants of God. To be continued. She knew perfectly well what Komarov was planning to do with his guests, but not once did she try to prevent the tragedy. To be continued. During the interrogations, Sofia Komarova spoke phlegmatically about her husband's new obsession. What can you do? You have to live somehow, as long as there isn't another war. In court, Vasily described his wife like this: a fool, weak. Meanwhile, Sofia took it upon herself to accompany her husband when disposing of the bodies. It began when Komarov, moving a corpse to the river, was stopped by a policeman asking what he was carrying. Continuation. The cabman grinned and offered the lawman to feel the sack, but he just waved him off. Who knows why? They didn't search Sanya back then, but Vasily decided to play it safe for the future. It turned out that a married couple arouses less suspicion at night than a lone man going who knows where with a big canvas bag. But before we continue and move on to the verdicts, let's take a look at the personalities of Vasily Komarov and his wife. Vasily Komarov, a classic example of a serial killer with traits of an alcoholic degenerate and a psychopath who, according to psychiatrists, was sane but showed a pronounced dullness of social feelings. This is a primitive personality, without the slightest remorse, with emotional dullness and a distorted value system. He felt neither pity nor guilt for any of his victims, showed not a drop of sympathy, and moreover, he was proud of what he had done and considered himself a hero. His speech was mocking, full of vile jokes, puns, and taunts like the phrase "Razik vas." After being deprived of life, he justified his actions by claiming he was fighting speculators and supposedly doing a good deed by cleansing society, but in fact, he enjoyed having power over life and death. His faith was superstitious and primitive. He prayed, invited priests, and then cynically declared that he only believed in the hedgehog because it was solid. Sadistic tendencies showed not only in taking lives. He regularly beat his wives and children, humiliated them, considered it normal, and took pleasure in violence. Back during the Civil War, when he led a firing squad, he admitted himself that he enjoyed being in command. At the execution, the medical report listed chronic alcoholism, alcohol-induced personality degeneration, and psychopathy with sadistic traits. However, despite all this, Komarov was found to be fully sane. He was aware of what he was doing and was able to control his actions. As for his motivation, it was money, but he himself presented it as a fight for justice. In reality, it was a mix of greed, sadism, revenge, and a sense of impunity. He killed with cold calculation, yet still saw himself as almost a victim of the system. Essentially, Komarov is not a monster in the classic sense, not a madman, but rather a degraded, cruel, soulless person, dull, ordinary, but all the more terrifying because of it. This is exactly what shocked his contemporaries and still shocks people to this day. Bulgakov wrote that evil's ordinariness meant what stood before them wasn't a demon, but just a human shell. As for his wife, Sofia Komarova, she was not a passive victim of her husband, but his accomplice, even if not from the very beginning. At first she seemed to accidentally catch Vasily dismembering a corpse, and he calmly told her, "Get used to it." Instead of being frightened or going to the police, she just took a rag and started wiping up the blood. From that moment on, she became his silent and later active accomplice. Sofia didn't have the pronounced sadistic traits her husband did, but she showed a remarkable indifference to taking lives. She knew that people were being killed in the house, helped clean up blood, wash the floors, hide evidence, sometimes held the victims, helped tie up the bodies, and took part in disposing of the corpses. Moreover, so as not to embarrass the guests, she would leave the house with the children in advance, and then return alone to help Vasily get rid of the bodies. It was a kind of household routine. She even prayed for the souls of the deceased, but never tried to stop her husband. Basically, she was a woman broken by daily life and violence. Vasily beat her, humiliated her, kept her in fear, but she accepted it, apparently thinking it was better to live with a serial killer than to be left without a husband and bread. This is a classic example of masochistic submission under conditions of domestic terror. During interrogations, she spoke phlegmatically, without emotion, as if it wasn't about 30 corpses, but something like, "Well, what can you do? You have to live somehow, as long as there's no war." Psychiatrists noted the same dullness of social feelings in her as in her husband. She wasn't mentally ill, she wasn't insane, but she was morally absolutely dead. Not a sadist, but rather an insensitive, oppressed, passive woman who became the perfect assistant for her maniac husband. The court found her guilty and sentenced her to execution, along with Vasily. Komarov called her a weak fool in court, but the facts said otherwise. She knowingly and systematically helped him take lives and cover up the traces. They were a criminal couple, where one was an active sadist and the other was his shadow. Silent but active. The trial of Komarov lasted several days, and each time it was again in the Polytechnic Museum building, because the crowd of people who wanted to see the strangler with their own eyes was extraordinary and did not diminish at all. People even came from other cities to gawk at the man-beast. At the beginning of the last century, such monstrous acts as serial crimes, especially committed by a single person, an ordinary citizen, were still a unique phenomenon. As a result, the trial of the young Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which lasted from June 6 to 9, 1923, sentenced Vasily Komarov and his wife Sofia to the highest punishment, execution by shooting. And on June 19th, 1923, the sentence against Vasily Petrov and Sofia Petrova was carried out. They were executed under their real surname, Petrov. Thus, the man who had kept the entire district in fear for several years was eliminated. The children of the terrible couple were placed under the care of the state after their surnames were changed. Mikhail Bulgakov, the young writer, concluded his essay on the Komarov case as follows: I sincerely hope that the harsh law of heredity will spare the children, and God forbid they resemble their late father and mother. Later, there were rumors that one of the sons of Petrova Komarova, whether biological or adopted is unknown, switched to the German side during the Great Patriotic War, but there is no reliable evidence of this. The Komarov case became a significant part of Soviet criminology history. In the Central Museum of the Ministry of Internal Affairs on Seleznevskaya Street in Moscow, the murder weapon of the Shabulovsky strangler is still kept to this day, a large rusty cobbler's hammer with a round handle. You can come and take a look when the museum is open. Vasily Komarov became a kind of anti-hero in urban folklore at the beginning of the last century. A song about him was sung everywhere by tavern singers, train beggars, and street children. There are many versions of this folk song, and one of them has survived to this day. It's even available on Yandex Music, though only in poetic form. Then a note appeared in the newspapers that made everyone gasp. It turned out that unknown bodies in bags were floating on ice floes. I'll finish this with documentary lines from the diaries of the Moscow commoner, memoirist, and prose writer Nikita Okunev. On June 19th, a certain Moscow cabman Komarov and his wife were tried and sentenced to execution by shooting. The first turned out to be the murderer of 32 people for the purpose of robbery, and the second was his accomplice. During the court's identification process, there was a countless crowd of Moscow women, girls, and hooligans who waited for whole days under the scorching sun and rain just for the chance to catch a glimpse of this terrifying hero of the day.